Welcome to another politics live stream here at Vice News. My name is Lee Adams. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. And as you know, we're here to talk about everything voter suppression running up to the general election this November, trying to understand all the ways that the government is going to try to suppress the votes of millions of Americans and potentially yourself. I'm going to be joined by three incredible guests today. Spanning the political professional spectrum from lawyers to professors at the Harvard Kennedy School. And we would like to invite all of the viewers out there to send in your questions that you have for our panelists, for our guests today. We're going to try to get to as much as possible. We're really excited to have this conversation with you all. And we can just go ahead and get things started here. I will be joined by Kristen Clarke. She's the president and executive director of the National Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. She testified before Congress yesterday on the 2020 general election preparations. Kristen, welcome. Thank you for being here. We're also joined by Professor Alexander Keyssar from the Harvard Kennedy School. He is the author of The Right to Vote, The Contested History of Democracy in the United States. And he has a new book coming out next week, Why Do We Still Have the Electoral College? Professor Keyssar, thank you, sir.
My pleasure.
And lastly, we have Michael Waldman, president of the Brennan Center for Justice at the NYU School of Law. Michael, thank you for taking the time out of your afternoon.
Great to be with you.
And so I think we should just start at the beginning when we're talking about voter suppression, because defining exactly what voter suppression is important to all of our viewers who may not have as much understanding of how this works and how it's worked previously moving into this election. So, Kristen, you were testifying before Congress yesterday. Talk to us a little bit about some of the things that you had mentioned in that congressional hearing, and tell us a little bit about what we mean when we say voter suppression and why we should be concerned about it.
Yeah. So the pandemic has upended life across our country, but it's also upended our elections. And we've seen that throughout the primary season. We've seen that people have been put in this impossible position of often having to choose between their health and exercising the right to vote. And so we've been fighting and working with groups like the Brennan Center to address those barriers that voters face. We want to make sure that everyone has voice in our democracy while we're wrestling with COVID-19. The hearing before Congress yesterday was about pushing Congress to put forth the money, the resources that states need to get it right. And so we're collectively advocating and pushing for $3.6 billion real money that can be allocated to every state across the country to make sure that they can't use money as an excuse to not do the right thing and to not do right by voters. When we say voter suppression, we're talking about dirty tactics and schemes used to silence voters, used to strip them of their voice. And sadly, in the last several years in our country, we have seen voter suppression on the rise. We've seen this rise particularly spike after a devastating ruling issued by the Supreme Court several years ago, a case called Shelby County, Alabama versus Holder, that cut out the heart of the Voting Rights Act, our nation's most important federal civil rights law. That court decision brought to a halt this federal review process that helped to block a lot of ugly voter suppression efforts that we've seen in some parts of our country. It was kind of like a checkpoint on democracy. And it's interesting because here we are in 2020 dealing with existing levels of voter suppression that's now been compounded by the pandemic. But I think that we can work to beat back those barriers to make sure at the end of the day that everyone has voice in our democracy. That's the work that we do each and every day.
I mean, voter suppression to me feels like it's as American as apple pie. I mean, as long as we have been voting in this country, we have been restricting people's access to vote. Professor Keyssar, talk to me a little bit about the historical implications of voter suppression, what it looked like in the past, and how it is sort of shaped itself to find a place in our democratic process today.
Sure, I'd like to do that. And one distinction that I want to make, and I don't think it's just purely arcane or definitional, is between disenfranchisement and voter suppression, because I think that helps us to understand why we're getting so much voter suppression right now. Our country has a long history of both. I mean, lots of people, millions and millions and millions of people, almost all African Americans, women, and immigrant workers in the late 19th century were disenfranchised in some ways. People who didn't own property in the first half of the 19th century. Gradually, the formal right to vote has expanded, ups and downs, but it has expanded. But what then happens is that, in some sense, after enfranchisement, often at a delay of 10 or 20 years, you then get voter suppression. I've sometimes quipped that voter suppression is what happens when you want to disenfranchise some people but can't. So you can't pass a law saying that that African Americans in Georgia can't vote. But what you can do is create a set of procedural obstacles, of precisely the sort that Kristen was talking about. Legal or quasi-legal procedural obstacles that will diminish that vote, and that's voter suppression. That's basically preventing the exercise of the vote by people who formally are legally entitled to vote. And if I'll pick up, to go on in the historical dimensions of this, the phrase or word vote suppression or voter suppression first appears in the late 19th century. And it appears after two things happen which have remarkable parallels to the current day. One thing that has happened is the Civil War is over, slavery's over, and African Americans are enfranchised by the 15th Amendment. So that formal right to vote is extended to African Americans. The second thing that is going on in the late 19th century in different parts of the country is very large-scale immigration. And that is also threatening the established political order. Voter suppression happens north and south, much more wholesale in the south than in the north. But it happens to reduce the power that African Americans have achieved in the south and that some immigrant workers have achieved in the north.
And Michael, when we talk about voter suppression, I think for a lot of folks, their mind immediately goes to things like voter ID laws. But it's much more insidious than that, and there are much more, strategies at work than just requiring you to have an ID. Talk to me about what some of those strategies may be running up to this November, and what we've seen recently, whether it was in the primaries or just a couple of years ago, even in places like Georgia with Stacey Abrams. How do you think this is going to play out?
Well, because the way we run elections in this country, going back 2 centuries and more, is not centralized. We don't have one election, even though we have the presidential election. We don't even have really 50 state elections. We have hundreds and hundreds of county by county elections. When you look for these tactics of voter suppression, they can often be hard to see, hard to discern, or they look neutral on their face, or they look technocratic and technical. Yet they're often crafted with a great deal of malevolence, as a federal appeals court put it, describing the North Carolina voter suppression law of a few years ago. It looked neutral on its face, but it was crafted with, quote, almost surgical precision to cut out black voters. So in this year, where we already knew going into this year that this was likely to be very high turnout. Turnout in this country is lower than in the other democratic world. In 2014, we had the lowest voter turnout in 72 years. But in 2018, we had the highest turnout in a century. There's a civic engagement that's pretty intense. We had every reason to think there were going to be a lot of people wanting to vote in 2020, and it really wasn't clear that the system was ready for them. And we already saw at the beginning of the primaries long lines, but really long lines in the Black and Latino communities, not in other places. We saw problems with counting the votes. We had the risk of people's sense of the security and integrity of the elections being diminished because of cybersecurity issues, something they didn't have to worry about quite as much, back in the founding era. They had other issues to worry about. And then as Kristen said, the pandemic comes along. And one of the things that, of course, worries all of us is just that it's going to be very hard to run a meaningful and fair and free election at all when people aren't able to leave their homes and vote the way they usually do. So you're going to see a significant increase in the number of people who want to vote by mail, who vote remotely. Polls show that more than half of people expect to do that this time. And between that and the ongoing problems with how we run elections, some of the things we're expecting to see this year, for example, are challenges and problems with how we do vote by mail. Are states saying, as the state of Texas, for example, insists that it should be able to, that you need to actually be sick to cast an absentee ballot. Right. The mere fact that you've been ordered to stay at home by the public health authorities doesn't count. In Alabama, to vote absentee or vote by mail, you need a notary to notarize your ballot, which, if you think about it, isn't really the safest thing for a senior citizen, who's voting. You also need in-person voting opportunities, because there are a lot of people who want to vote in person or who need to vote in person. And we know that, for example, the rate of rejection of mail-in ballots for Black voters is much higher than for white voters. But then you have the problems, many of which were let loose by the Supreme Court's gutting of the Voting Rights Act, as was described, of polling place closures. In the primary in Wisconsin, Milwaukee went from having 180 polling places typically to 5. Now that wasn't.
Oh my God.
They were like that wasn't just because they had Bull Connor running the elections in Democratic Milwaukee. That's because they couldn't get poll workers to show up. But that happened in the biggest Black city in the state and not in other places. So we see these things play out. Basically, the thing we're coming to see is that the ongoing problem of the pandemic and the kind of good old-fashioned problem of vote suppression, unfortunately, is melding. More people will have their voice blunted, but it's not everybody having their voice blunted simultaneously in the same way.
Kristen, I wanted to ask, you were urging Congress yesterday to extend resources necessary to prevent a lot of issues from taking place in the general election. Why is it a problem to ignore voter suppression as we look forward to November?
Yeah, I mean, the right to vote, I think, is the most important and sacred right in our democracy. And when people can't exercise voice, I think that that's deeply problematic. This fight before Congress is about making sure that no state can use the excuse that we just don't have the resources to do this right. We want to make sure that we take that away and really put states in the position of making sure that every citizen in their jurisdiction is able to vote amid this global pandemic. I think about some of this, we heard about Alabama. I also think about states like Texas and Tennessee, where officials have taken the position that fear of contracting COVID is not a legitimate basis to get an absentee ballot. That is incredibly problematic. Tennessee actually goes a step further. In Tennessee, it is a crime. It's a Class A misdemeanor to distribute absentee ballot applications to the public, to have a link on your website where you're making available the absentee ballot application widely. And so we're suing Tennessee over the barriers that they're creating that will unnecessarily disenfranchise people and silence people in 2020. But in thinking about your question, I also it made me think about the moment that we're in. We're in a moment, this is an inflection point for the country. We've got protests and demonstrations that are part of our new normal. We have people who are marching and demonstrating and proclaiming proudly that Black Lives Matter, are demanding police reform, are saying enough is enough, that now is the time that we confront our nation's sordid history of racial violence and white supremacy. And I think that this moment of protest is incredibly promising because it brings with it the possibility of change and reform in a way that we've not seen previously. But to me, an extension of that is voting. I believe that voting is a powerful form of protest activity in our democracy. And I think that we are bracing for an election season where we will see historic levels of high turnout and participation. But we won't see it if we stand by idly while voter suppression persists. So this is a fight that I think that we all have to roll up our sleeves and engage in. Now is the time that we use the 102 days that we have between now and the November election to really confront and tear down the obstacles that are standing between voters and the ballot box.
Professor Keyssar, Michael, would
in?
you? Yeah, please, by all means.
No, I just wanted to say, I mean, I agree with everything that Kristen said, but I just wanted to say that in answer to, to your question about, why would it be, such a bad thing if voter suppression continued? The most basic virtue of democracy is that the people can change the government, and can change the government that is already in power. Okay, if you don't like them, you can throw them out. Well, if you do things like voter suppression or partisan gerrymandering, etc., you are in effect preventing the people from exercising what is really one of the foremost, qualities and features of a democratic government. And that's what this, and right now, I mean, as been pointed out, we all know we live in a time when democratic norms have been attacked and are eroded, and in this election will be at some level a contest between forces that want to continue eroding them and forces that want to build them back up and shore them up. And that's why dealing with voter suppression in this election is extremely important.
Michael, would you agree that voting is a form of protest, or at the very least following through on said protest?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's the most small d, purely egalitarian moment we have in our society. Everybody's voice and vote counts equally, at least in theory. It is something where at the moment where it looks darkest and where it looks as though the forces of power have entrenched themselves, where the people can really step up if they're given the chance to make their voice heard. And it's really very central to, not always to the reality, but to certainly our ideal of who we are as Americans and what our country stands for and has meant in the world. And it's been a fight over many years to make it more real than it has been at some times, but it's very much at the heart of what we believe is special, or can be, or should be special about the country. And it's very true that right now we're seeing almost a backlash against the spread of democracy in countries all over the world. We're seeing authoritarian or wannabe authoritarian leaders in many other countries, whether in Turkey or in Russia or in many, many places. And the distressing thing is when we see it here in our country. We've had many elections in a time of crisis. I mean, we've had elections during wars. We had elections with 1 million people overseas during World War II. We had the election during the Spanish flu of 1918. Abraham Lincoln was really determined to have the 1864 election, even though he thought he was going to lose, because he thought it was so important to show that the rebels could not defeat democracy in that way. We've never had, in such an overt way, at least not recently, the leader of one of the political parties, let alone the president of the United States, vocally trying to undermine the election. Just yesterday, President Trump said this is going to be, quote, the most corrupt election in history because of vote by mail, something that already 1 out of 4 people, including Donald Trump, uses on a routine basis. hasn't previously been the most controversial thing in this whole field. I mean, to say this is the most corrupt election in history, Richard Nixon's ghost is probably really jealous of that statement, and to have him saying it's rigged and corrupt, and that his followers, who are going to be a very large chunk of the electorate, should basically ignore the results of the election, that it was all rigged. To have that from the President of the United States is extraordinary, and is something all of us who care about the vote and democracy and the rule of law have to grapple with.
I want to throw this question out to the group. I mean, it seems to me, at least in my mind, that voting by mail is a tremendous step forward in combating voter suppression across the country. But when you have the president, as Michael pointed out, saying that, it's a threat to the election, it's going to be a rigged election, you can't trust it, and kind of laying the groundwork for fighting against voting by mail, how do you all react to that?
Well, I suspect that we all think that really what he's doing is laying the groundwork for creating a mess or challenging the outcome in the fall. As is the case with at least some of the kinds of claims that he makes, it is true that voting by mail is a complicated and can be a cumbersome process, and there are and will be glitches in the execution of it. Not in the states that have been doing it for 4 or 5 or 8 years. They've sort of worked out the kinks. But there will be, and I think we have to anticipate that, there will be glitches in different states that are doing large-scale mail-in voting for the first time. But those are glitches. They're not fraud. There's nothing there that's going to undermine the election. I mean, we also ought to keep in mind that the one well-known recent instance of voter fraud in mail-in voting was done by a Republican operative in North Carolina to try to secure the vote for his candidate. But I guess my overall point is, I don't think that we can just say, look, voting by mail is a perfect system. It's that there's nothing that can go wrong. I think that is the way it will turn out in states with some experience with it. But there will be glitches, which means that all of us in different organizations have to be vigilant, have to try to help out, because those glitches will not and ought not be regarded as as real defects in the election.
One of the things that's interesting is, so first of all, the one thing we know for sure is that there's a decent chance that the election will not be called on election night. And because of the amount of time it takes, even in the states that have been doing it well, like California or Oregon or Washington, it just takes longer to count the mail-in ballots. And in so much of the country, they're not used to doing it this way. New York State, which kind of is uniquely, where I live, which is uniquely inept, they're still counting the ballots from the June 23rd primary for Congress. And that doesn't mean it's fraud. That means they're counting the ballots. And it's important that the anchors on election night not get up there and describe it as a chaotic surprise when we know it's going to happen. The one good thing, or one of the good things that we've seen, at least in our work at the Brennan Center this year, is so many of the election officials of both parties are really, really eager to get this right. They really want to do it right. They understand the challenge. They understand the risks. They're calling for Congress to, as Kristen Clarke testified yesterday, to fund the states to get this done. This is, obviously, there's a lot of partisanship around this issue, and it's always been raw and political throughout American history. But on this, the further away we get from Washington, the less partisan it is, and they just kind of want the help to get it done right. So we all of us need to be doing what we can to kind of back them up and give them some political cover.
The MO with President Trump has been cause chaos and confusion, just chaos and confusion. And this discussion we're having right now reminds me of one of the big threats that we face this season, and that's election misinformation. And President Trump is one of the biggest purveyors of false information about our elections out there. He's at one point suggested absentee ballots are okay, but vote by mail fraud. They're the same thing. There is no difference between the two. And he suggested that there are countries out there that are going to print false ballots, and it's going to be the most fraudulent election that we've ever seen. And these are claims that are baseless. And if he's aware of countries like Russia that are out there with the intent of disrupting our elections, then we should be doing something about it. But the fact of the matter is that even in the wake of hard and real evidence that countries like Russia intend to interfere with our election, we've turned a blind eye to those problems. But social media, so the social media platforms need to do more. We really have been engaged in a lot of advocacy with Facebook and Twitter and social media platforms to get them to really police people, including the occupant of the White House, when they abuse the platforms to spread misinformation to voters, because frankly, that is another form of vote suppression. When you tell people, hey, the election's on Wednesday, the election hours are, from X to Z and it's false, when you put out information about the wrong qualifications for voting, when you say that absentee balloting is fraudulent and shouldn't be used, these are forms of vote suppression. And so part of the work that we have to do is making sure that we're holding social media platforms accountable.
And if you're just joining us, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just was going to say that there's a disturbing analogy between the Trump administration's approach to the pandemic itself, to the disease, to COVID-19, and to absentee voting or mail-in voting. I mean, the fact is that each of those represents a problem, a real problem. And in the case of the pandemic, we all know they've been regarding it as a non-problem, saying it's maybe a problem, that it's a past problem, but it's going to take care of itself. In the case of absentee voting, there's a serious problem. How do you conduct an election in a pandemic? Well, just imagine that we lived in a country where the federal government said, yeah, this is a serious problem. Elections are mostly run by the states, but let's do our best to invest resources and establish procedures and rules to make this work. And that's just not what's happening. What's happening is an attempt to make it more dysfunctional rather than to solve a legitimate problem.
And if you're just joining us, thank you. We are discussing all things voter suppression here today. If you are a member of the audience, feel free to send us your questions and your comments in the chat section below. We do have a question coming in from our viewers. And Kristen, I want to direct this one to you first. Someone responded that asking people to identify themselves is not voter suppression. Mail-in voting is too easy to rig. We've been discussing this, but talk to me about, voter ID laws. They're a lot older than the elections of the past 2, 4, and 8 years, right? They go back quite some time. What is your response to that comment?
Yeah. So strict photo ID, strict government issued photo ID laws do have an impact. And they have an impact not on people who drive and have driver's license, not on people who get on planes and have passports. They have an impact on the most marginalized among us, the poorest of the poor, the folks who rely on public transportation and so have never been to a DMV office, the folks who are homeless. And so when states put photo ID laws on the books, they often know that they are doing so at the risk of disenfranchising those marginalized communities. And for civil rights organizations like mine, like Michael's, we push back and stand up for the most marginalized among us. That is what democracy is about, making sure that everyone has voice. So why do officials gamble on photo ID laws? Our elections actually have become hotly contested. They come down to razor thin margins in many communities. There was actually an election in Virginia that was so close that it was resolved by a coin toss. You've got elections that come down to like a couple dozen, a couple hundred people. And so these voter suppression tactics are pursued because they can actually have impact under those kinds of circumstances. You peel off 1-2% of the electorate here, 1-2% there, and all of a sudden you've managed to flip the outcome of an election. And we're living in a world today where we actually have access to a lot of data, and you can almost predict. And in fact, we retain experts when we litigate these cases that say, here is the documented impact. In Texas, when they put their restrictive photo ID law on the books back in 2013, and they did so actually on the very day that the Supreme Court issued that devastating Shelby County versus Holder case that I mentioned earlier. When they put that law on the books, they disenfranchised tens of thousands of people in Texas who had been voting for years, but who just didn't have one of the qualifying forms of ID when that ID was adopted. Driver's license, passport, a conceal and carry permit, college IDs didn't count. I mean, lawmakers know what they're doing. And Michael mentioned the framing of a Fourth Circuit case that said lawmakers in North Carolina acted with almost surgical precision. It's not just in North Carolina, it's in a lot of states. They know exactly what they're doing. They know exactly who they're impacting. So I appreciate that question about the photo ID. I'm sure every single one of us right here has an ID. I'm sure that the person who asked that question has an ID. But the problem is, what about the 1 or 2% of us out there who don't? Should we tolerate a democracy where they are silenced and voiceless and disenfranchised? And I think that the answer is no.
And the Brennan Center has done research on who doesn't have these kinds of photo IDs. And again, Kristen's exactly right. I don't think it's crazy for people to have to be who they say they are, or even to have to prove it. The problem is not those kinds of requirements per se. It's these very carefully crafted requirements for forms of ID that lots of people just don't have. Our study, which has been used by many courts and has not been repudiated, is that 11% of people, when we surveyed this, of eligible voters, did not have the kinds of photo ID with a specific date, like a driver's license, basically, that these states are requiring. And look, it is possible to have voter ID laws. A state like Rhode Island passed a voter ID law. It gave people lots of different types of ID that they could use. And it doesn't disenfranchise people, but there's not a surge of fraud either. These are carefully crafted laws. That Texas example, Stephen Colbert at the time said, well, look, that's really very egalitarian. It's a lot easier to get a concealed carry gun permit than a college degree. But the kind of mischievous intent behind that law is replicated all over the country. And you see it in lots of, I also think that it's because of the narrowness of our current politics. A lot of this kind of people realized in 2000, when the election was, basically a tie, that every little bit could make a difference. And it's also a function, just as in the progressive era, in the Gilded Age a century ago, that Professor Keyssar described, of massive demographic and economic change, of the electorate changing, of it becoming more diverse, and the majority faction. Back then, it was kind of Protestants looking at a Catholic immigration surge, or former slaves being enfranchised, and now it's white voters in general thinking they need to change the rules to retain their power. And it's not a surprise in some ways that this would be as intense as it is right now.
To follow up a little bit on whoops, sorry, I did.
No, go ahead.
But I just wanted to follow up a little bit on these points, particularly Michael's. That one of the points that is made by people who are proponents of voter ID is, well, voter IDs are required in a lot of countries to vote, and that's true. And as a rule, in those countries, the ID that you have to present is your national identity card, which everybody has, and and is issued in a very standard way to everyone by the government. I mean, one response that I would be inclined to make to people who say, well, we need to prevent fraud. I mean, in addition to saying that there really isn't any fraud, but that's it's a different argument, is that if you want to have a voter ID regime in a state of the United States, you can do that, but make it incumbent upon the state to provide everybody with an ID. It's the state's responsibility, not the individual's. And there are even mechanisms you can imagine that would say that if somebody showed up at the polls and didn't have an ID, they could fill out, they could cast a provisional ballot right there and fill out a form that would lead the state to send them an ID within the next 2 weeks. These are soluble problems if you want to solve them.
And those countries use those IDs principally for their national health insurance.
Right.
So Medicare for all side effect.
I was going to mention that in Wisconsin, for example, we were seeing DMVs not issuing the IDs that the state government had mandated because they were being overrun or for a number of different reasons. And something that I think a lot of people miss in this conversation is that while, yes, it is true, it disproportionately affects voters of color, but it also disproportionately affects voters of a specific class in America, a specific income level. And so we're starting to get a lot of pushback in the comment section, but I'd love to hear you all weigh in on that because people are asking, what's the big deal with just getting a plain ID? Why is it so difficult? If you want to vote, you should be able to get an ID. So I'd love to have you all weigh in here.
Well, if, for example, you shut down the offices, in many cases it was even if you don't want a driver's license, you want to get an ID, you go to a registry of motor vehicles. So you can shut down the registry of motor vehicles offices, as has happened, and say, well, you can go get one, but it's 45 miles from where you live. By definition, you don't have a driver's license and you likely don't have a car. And to get the ID, you have to show up. And you might have to bring your birth certificate and your social security card and documents that not everyone, including myself, has right at hand.
And I would say too that in a lot of respects, and maybe my colleagues don't agree with this, the fight over voter ID isn't really the most intense fight right now. It's kind of played out, and courts have limited a lot of the very worst voter ID laws, saying they violate your constitutional rights. That law in Texas, which disenfranchised when it was implemented 608,000 registered voters in Texas. Well, the federal court really blunted the worst aspects of it. What you're seeing this year is in this crazy pandemic situation, the opportunity to have a considerable barrier to participation for millions and millions of people, lots of whom have an ID, or people who thought they could vote or never had a problem voting before, but because of this extraordinary health situation. And President Trump blurted out early on in this his motive on this. He said, so the House of Representatives, Congress passed $400 million already to help states run safe elections. And in fact, the House of Representatives passed $3.6 billion in the current discussions over a stimulus. Early on in this, Trump said, if you have some of the stuff in there, these things like vote by mail, you'll have voting levels that are so high, we'll never win. And he at least did the kind of favor of like saying it out loud, but that was not the script. And then a couple of days later, he remembered the script and said, what I meant to say is, I'm very worried about voter fraud. This isn't about voter fraud. This is some politicians seeing an opportunity to restrict the electorate because they think it'll help them stay in office. And we ought to understand it as part of the chicanery of American politics. There's zillions of ways of making sure elections are safe and secure. And the biggest risks to our elections right now are that people are going to have their votes not cast, not counted, not get their ballots, or that Russia or China or North Korea, Iran, or whoever are going to do what Russia did in 2016, which is try to mess with the machinery of our election. Those are it's not that there isn't risks to election integrity. We ought to focus on the real risks, which are people not getting their ballots, not getting their votes counted, and the kind of cybersecurity risks and fake news that could really mess with the election.
Yeah, I like the way Michael put it. The arguments about photo ID are played out. There have been so many battles around this in the courts. And, it's not the only form of voter suppression that's out there. You also have purging of the voter registration rolls. States or counties that say, oh, we're just cleaning up the registration rolls, and they strip away completely eligible voters from the rolls. And when we've gone in and investigated these schemes in places like Hancock County, Georgia, and elsewhere, we found that the vast majority of people that they're cleaning up and removing from the rolls are African American or poor African American voters. Consolidating polling sites or just shutting down polling sites is also another scheme that we see a lot. We beat back a scheme in Randolph County, Georgia, where officials sought to shut down 9 of 11 polling sites in a county that would have left folks with two polling sites, and another poor majority African American community where it would have been incredibly difficult to vote on election day. And then you've got schemes like moving polling sites to places deemed hostile by voters of color. So an example of this is Macon-Bibb County, Georgia, where officials sought to move a polling site from a majority Black school to the local sheriff's office. And the community protested and said, look, we are not comfortable going to the sheriff's office to vote. And they resisted. And so we worked with the community and eventually evoked a petition procedure under state law that got that polling site moved to a majority Black church. But these are the ugly tactics that we're dealing with right now, not the 1960s, but they're kind of like out of that 1960s playbook. They're right out of the Jim Crow playbook. And this is what we're up against in 2020. Now you got the pandemic piled on top of all of that, and it's just made the fight all the more challenging and difficult.
Yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead, Michael, please.
And inject a note of optimism, which is just as the challenges are particularly acute and the vote suppression is particularly visible, there's a response too that is much stronger and a focus on the strength and the health of our democracy that's much more widespread than has been in years and years. I mentioned the election officials of both parties who are really trying to get it right. Voters really care about this. In 2018, there were ballot initiatives all over the country to create redistricting reform commissions to end felony disenfranchisement in Florida, which passed by 64% of the vote, and to enact automatic voter registration in Michigan. In New York State today, the legislature, which is notoriously dysfunctional, passed a very strong automatic voter registration bill, which will automatically register voters not just at the DMV, but at social welfare agencies and health agencies as well. It's a real paradigm shift in how we register voters in New York and for the country too. And the House of Representatives passed 2 incredibly strong and important bills this session of Congress. H.R. 1, which would have automatic voter registration and redistricting reform and other things nationwide, and the bill H.R. 4 to restore the Voting Rights Act, which was just introduced yesterday in the Senate and named, of course, after the late Congressman John Lewis. This is something that could be a moment of public engagement and pushback on these issues that could lead to a reform period that could really transform how we run our democracy in a very positive way.
Yeah, I wanted to ask the group, where have you seen some of this same progress and what gives you hope for, an encouraging outcome when we think about standing in opposition to voter suppression? Because I think a lot of people, it can be overwhelming to hear these things, and then it can instill a feeling of helplessness that there's not really anything I can do. What can we look forward to doing? What can we do to actively play a role in curtailing the effects of voter suppression?
Yeah, it's important to strike a balance. I mean, I'm glad we're having this discussion and just kind of keeping it real and talking about some of the threats, because we have to be vigilant. We have to be on our toes. We have to speak out when we see voter suppression so that we can beat it back. And I think that there are a lot of people who are motivated right now and mobilized. We run a program at my organization, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, called Election Protection. It's the nation's largest and longest running nonpartisan voter protection program, and it's anchored by a hotline, 866-OUR-VOTE, 866-OUR-VOTE. And we hear from voters a lot who are saying, I think there's something happening in our community. And we're glad when we get those calls, because it gives us a chance to go in and investigate and try and deal with it before Election Day, or deal with it before it has impact on other people. But I do think that, there's just a lot that we can do to make sure that everybody is able to have voice in our democracy. One thing that we can do right now is work to make sure that everyone in our network, in our circles, in our communities are registered to vote, because the pandemic actually has had a little bit of an impact on the way that people ordinarily get onto the registration rolls, right? If you're not on a college campus, you may not have been touched by a voter registration drive. Churches are, ordinarily passing out registration forms to congregants, and organizations are often knocking on doors in communities where they know that there may be people who are not yet registered based on data. And so this is a moment where we can all, play a role. There are about 40 states where you can register to vote online, and not everybody knows that. So making sure that we're just working and pushing people to take the steps necessary to get registered, to make sure that they're registered and able to vote, are just some of the good, and healthy things that we can do for democracy right now.
What should you do if you go to the polls on Election Day and you find that you have been unregistered? You find that you are one of those folks that have been purged. What can you do? What should you do?
Don't give up. Stand your ground. Call that hotline, that 866-OUR-VOTE hotline. This is a federal election season, and every American citizen who believes that they are registered to vote and should be on the rolls, if you're told that you're not on the rolls, you have a right to vote by way of a provisional ballot. So there's nobody who should be turned away in this federal election season. We don't like when people vote by way of provisional ballots, because sometimes those ballots aren't ultimately counted, but sometimes they are. Sometimes election officials go back to their office and realize that there was some omission that happened, and that person was indeed eligible and the vote is counted. But stand your ground. It's a federal election, and if you believe you registered, insist that you get a ballot. If not the regular ballot, the provisional ballot. But you can do work now to get prepared and actually take steps to make sure that you're registered, that you're an active registered voter, and hopefully, just take some steps to make sure that you have no problem when you go in on Election Day.
And people can make sure that if they think they're going to want to vote by mail or vote absentee, especially if they aren't used to doing it, try to get that ballot lined up now, because for so many people it's going to be different this year than what it usually is, and people don't know which envelope to use and how to do it. So voters are being asked to do something new under unusual and extraordinary circumstances, but they can get started early, and there's lots of groups and political entities to help them.
I think one other thing that people can, well, I'm sorry.
No, please, by all means.
It is to take these steps in advance of the election, or maybe at the time of the election, with your own network of friends, to make it something of a collective endeavor. Not just I have to figure this out, but that gather together 3, 4, 5, 6 friends and say, okay, are we gonna vote by mail? If so, have we taken the steps? What are we gonna do? I think that kind of thing makes it sort of, in some sense, more political, but also more fun and less lonely.
As Professor Keyssar,
please, Michael, by all means.
Professor Keyssar's book describes how in the 19th century, this before there was television or radio, politics was the participatory activity everybody engaged in. One of the ironic consequences of the secret ballot is that people didn't go down to the polling place with their fellow neighbors or their ethnic group or their tribe and all vote together as kind of a public statement of solidarity. But there are ways now on social media to do just that.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, in the age of the pandemic, considering health and the risk associated with appearing to vote in person, not to be overly dramatic, but we're getting comments in the chat that people are saying things like in-person voting will be the death of us, right? Is it worth risking your life or potentially your health to vote?
No, that's an easy answer.
No.
But states have to do this right. States have to do this right. So here's what we're pushing for. 3 avenues that give voters access this season. Absentee balloting, right? No excuse. Everyone should have access to an absentee ballot if that's the way they want to vote. And states should make it really easy. They should provide postage paid envelopes. They should send the ballot to all registered voters so that you skip that application step, which can be long and cumbersome. They should provide instructions so that voters who are doing this, who are voting by this method for the first time, know how to do it and know how to do it successfully, right? So get absentee balloting right. The second thing that you have to do is provide lots of opportunities for people to go out and early vote. 2 weeks is what we're pushing for. 2 weeks of expansive early voting opportunities so that you won't have crowds and long lines. And we give people who want that opportunity to vote in person the chance to do so, and to do so in a way that will hopefully alleviate the burden that voters face on Election Day itself. And then what we want on Election Day is safe, secure voting, right? Sites where we're complying with social distancing guidelines, sites where we have PPE and sanitized voting machines, right? To the extent you have touch screens. And we want lots of polling sites, not 5 like what we saw in Milwaukee, where disproportionate numbers of Black voters were subjected to those long lines that stretched for hours. But lots of polling sites that give people meaningful access on Election Day. And if you do all of that right, hopefully lots of voters will have voted prior to Election Day, and we won't have the groundswell of people that will otherwise, see come November 3rd. That to me is kind of the formula to success in the middle of the pandemic that we're in. And it's also why we need Congress to put $3.6 billion on the table so that states can get all of those steps right.
Already, before this year, 1 out of 3 Americans who votes before Election Day. They vote by mail or they vote early voting. And this time, all the new people who will want to vote absentee, you're really not going to have those. It ought to be possible to not have those chaotic lines and scenes at polling places if Congress provides the funds. States do not have the resources to do this. They have ballot budget requirements. They have obviously other crushing health and economic needs. Only Congress can do this. And it's going to happen if it happens in the next few weeks as they're assessing what to do with this new stimulus. And everybody who's hearing our word, I hope you will reach out to your members of Congress of both parties and say, this is a must do as part of this stimulus. If we believe in our democracy, this coronavirus is an economic crisis, obviously, and it's a health crisis. We can't let it be a democracy crisis in November. And I constantly think back to that Wisconsin primary where the state legislature in the end would not let the governor postpone it. This election is not going to be postponed. It's a federal presidential and congressional election. But the speaker of the Wisconsin Assembly, who insisted that the election happen in person, despite it risking people's health, he held a press conference. He was talking to reporters the day of the primary. And he said, oh, no, don't worry. People are not risking their health. There's no problem here. Everybody should vote. And he was wearing a hazmat suit. at the time because that's what he needed to wear to go to the polling place. We can't let that happen in 50 states all over the country. And the key to that is Congress acting.
But to add a mildly more pessimistic note, I mean, I agree with everything that Kristen and Michael said, but I'm not so confident that Congress is going to act adequately. I think a lot of states will, probably most states will figure it out and will do this and will carry out this election pretty well. But there are going to be places, going back to your original question, people asking, do I want to risk my life, in order to vote? We shouldn't dismiss the possibility that there are going to be places where it's going to look like that's the choice. I mean, I think that we'll have a better idea in a month or two where those places are and how to try to focus on creating safety for voters there. But I think we have to recognize that all of the, if they put the three of us in charge, and gave us the army and we were just in charge of everything, we could make this election happen just fine. But they're not going to do that. And there are going to be some problems in a few places.
No army. I'm
no, you're sorry.
With these
and no DHS. No.
Yeah, as we see President Trump going to roll law enforcement to cities across the country, I'm actually deeply worried about that. So no army. No law enforcement, no military. That has a chilling effect on the electorate. Another tactic out of the Jim Crow playbook, but another issue that I think we got to be wary of in these 100 days or so leading up to the election.
I apologize.
So as we wrap up, no worries. As we wrap up here, I did want to ask you all one final question. And first, I wanted to thank you all for being here with me this afternoon. You've been so generous with your time, and we really appreciate it. Professor Keyssar, I'll start this off with you. What is keeping you up at night when you think about voter suppression moving into this coming election, and where lower income Americans are concerned, because as the pandemic has shown, it has disproportionately affected those lower income neighbors that we all have. What should we be looking for, and what are you concerned about?
Well, I'm concerned about the number of things that we refer to. I'm concerned about purchase of voter rolls that will affect those lower income neighborhoods. I'm concerned about finding out that your polling place has moved and maybe moved, a good distance. And I'm concerned about whether there will be adequate support on people to the polls, etc. With the pandemic, some of the traditional things of, well, we'll give you a ride to the polls. Some people may be more reluctant to do that. I'm concerned about the number of poll workers that might be needed and whether they will be comfortable. So there's not one thing on the voter suppression side. There might be some other things on what's going to happen on Washington side. Voter suppression side, it's not one thing. It's a collection of small to medium-sized things, which I think could have very negative consequences.
Michael, how about you?
Well, in addition, I agree with those things. I'm also kept awake by, among other things, by the risk that the integrity of the election will be called into question by the fake news, by the misinformation, by the bogus charges of voter fraud, and by just the general disorganization that's going to come this year because of all the things people are having to do for the first time. And that will be used or will cause us to doubt the integrity and the legitimacy of the election. It's not going to be over on election day. We have to not expect it to have some big announcement at 11 o'clock on East Coast time. And we need to be patient and ready to insist on a real and meaningful and truly democratic election, even if it takes time.
And Kristen, same question to you with the added follow-up of how do we keep ourselves accountable looking ahead to November? How do we keep our electeds accountable for protecting the weight of our vote and our ability to carry out that vote, to cast that ballot?
Yeah. Well, if you ask me to really answer your question about what keeps me up at night, Justice Ginsburg's health keeps me up at night. I am praying that she is able to fight this latest round of cancer that she's dealing with. But back to the question and the subject at hand, I'm feeling a little more hopeful these days. Alex, I actually think that we've seen some, despite the problems and chaotic scenes in many places throughout the primary season, we've actually seen some record turnout numbers during the primary. The ability to participate by mail where officials are allowing it, people are taking advantage of it. And so we're actually seeing, some primaries with higher turnout numbers than we've ever seen. But that's not uniform. Ohio was a place where we actually saw a drop. Ohio was a bit of a disaster. You can access the absentee voter application online, but there was no option to mail it in to send it in by email or in any electronic format. You had to print it out, and you had to physically send it in. You could hand write a form if you didn't have a computer and a way to print the form out. It was just a bit of a disaster. But I think we've seen a little bit more, some more success stories than not. But just thinking about the last part of your question, I just think about this moment that we are in. 2020 has shaped up to be a heck of a year, one fraught with challenge, but one just fraught with hope. And the protest and the Black Lives Matter movement that's underway really just gives me reason for hope. And I am incredibly hopeful that people will just march their way to the ballot box in November, or march their way to obtaining and getting access to absentee ballots for November, and hopeful that people will call our hotline, the Election Protection 866 Our Vote hotline, if they need help. And if I can, I just, as we close out, just want to say a word of remembrance about the great John Lewis. His life, his legacy fuels so much of the work that we do. And he was such a champion for voting rights throughout every decade of his life. And so, for me, I feel a great debt for the tremendous work that he did throughout his life, and a tremendous sense of obligation to carry forth his legacy. And we do that, we all do that by fighting voter suppression. We do that by exercising the right to vote. And we do that by advocating for things like the Voting Rights Act and for reforms that will make it easier for everyone to participate.
And that will do it for all of us here at Vice News. To my guests, thank you all for being here. Thank you for the incredibly important work that you are doing each and every day. Keep an eye out for Professor Keyssar's book, Why Do We Still Need the Electoral College, coming out next week. And to our viewers, there it is. To our viewers, I want to say thank you for tuning in as well. We will see you again very, very soon. Thank you. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.